March 10, 1945. The sirens wailed for the last time, and then came a silence that never left Tokyo. By dawn, 100,000 lives were gone. Most were women, children, the elderly asleep when the fire found them. The B-29 seconds had left behind a city of wind and flame. But what came next wasn't fire, it was absence. No footsteps, no shouts, only the faint crackle of things still burning. Those who crawled out from shelters said it felt like walking on another planet, the air thick with soot, the sky the color of blood. Everywhere they looked, there was motionless ruin. But what many don't realize is that this story didn't end when the bombs stopped falling. It began the moment the noise faded, because when the sirens ended and the last flame sank into smoke, Tokyo entered a silence deeper than death, a silence filled with the unburied, the missing, and the unnamed. And beneath that silence lay something the world forgot: the graves that were never marked, and the people who were never found. That's the story we're uncovering, the story of Tokyo's forgotten graves. The fire stopped before dawn, the smoke did not. When the sun rose on March 11th, 1945, Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a memory smoldering in place. The survivors crawled out of their shelters slowly, shielding their faces from the heat that still shimmered off the ground. What had been wooden homes only hours earlier were now patterns of ash. Entire neighborhoods, miles of them reduced to glowing outlines on the earth. A woman named Kyoko Matsuda, who survived near the Sumida River, remembered the sound. It was too quiet, not a single bird, no voices, only a soft crackling, like paper burning somewhere far away. She said she thought she had gone deaf until she heard someone sob once, then stop. The air was thick with metal and smoke. People wandered barefoot, their skin blistered, their faces grey with soot. Some carried buckets, some carried children, and some carried nothing at all. At the intersections where shops once stood, the asphalt had melted. Telephone poles leaned like broken crosses. Tram lines had twisted into knots. Those who had run toward the rivers the night before now lay still along the banks, the lucky ones found in shallow water, their arms locked around one another. Others were half buried in the mud, their bodies already unrecognizable. A young student volunteer wrote later, "We called their names, but the wind answered first. The smell told us where to dig." Near Ueno, temple bells rang faintly, not for prayers, but to guide survivors toward help stations. But there was little help to give. The city's medical centers were gone. The fire had taken doctors and nurses with the patients they tried to save. Families began to search for their own. Mothers clawed at the ash with their hands. Fathers lifted roof tiles, hoping for a sign, a ring, a shoe, a photograph that hadn't burned. One man was seen standing motionless in the ruins of his home, holding a teapot. When asked why, he said, "It's the only thing that still remembers our house." The silence was everywhere. It pressed down on the survivors like the heat itself. Even the sky seemed empty, no planes, no clouds, just the dull orange haze of dust and smoke drifting toward the sea. And then came the realization that the sirens were gone. They would never sound again because there was no one left to sound them. Tokyo had endured earthquakes, floods, and war before, but never this kind of quiet. The kind that makes you wonder if the world itself has ended. As the day wore on, the survivors began to gather, some at parks, others by rivers, carrying what little they had left. Children called out for their mothers. No one answered. Priests walked barefoot through the ruins, chanting softly, their voices breaking from the smoke. But soon, even that faded. And when night fell again, Tokyo glowed faintly in the dryst. Darkness, not with life, but with embers, a city still burning from within. The fire had ended, the silence had not. Tokyo had no graveyards left, only rivers, empty lots, and silence. In the days that followed the Great Fire, the numbers no longer made sense. Officials tried to count the dead, but how do you count what's been turned to ash? Everywhere there were remains along the Sumida River, beneath bridges, inside collapsed shelters. Some were burned beyond recognition, others were fused together by the heat. Entire families gone, without a single name to mark their place. A police officer assigned to the Koto district wrote in his report, "We could not tell where one person ended and another began. The ashes had mixed. The government had no plan for a disaster of this scale. There were too many to bury properly, and too few still alive to do it. So they turned to mass cremation. Temple courtyards, schoolyards, and even playgrounds became pyres. Bodies were stacked, fuel poured, flames reignited. Priests stood beside them, whispering sutras through tears. But soon there weren't enough priests, nor enough wood, nor enough time. So the fires burned without prayers, and the ashes drifted with the wind. At one Buddhist temple in Asakusa, volunteers carried charred remains in baskets. When asked how they would identify them, one said softly, "We cannot, but we can still say a name." That was all they could offer, a name without a body. Survivors searched through ruins, lifting roof tiles and cinders, hoping for something recognizable. A ring, a locket, a buckle from a child's shoe. One woman later said, "I found my mother's hairpin. That was enough. I buried it." For countless others, there was nothing left to find. No ashes, no bones, not even a shadow. In the official ledgers, those people became missing. In the hearts of their families, they were never anything less than alive. A young mother, Sada Iwata, carried home a small wooden box filled with soil from the ruins of her neighborhood. "I told my children this is where their father sleeps," she wrote. "Even if it's not true, it's all we have." The Japanese word for grave haka means both burial place and memory. After the air raids, most families only had the latter. The line between the living and the lost blurred completely. Letters kept arriving from soldiers who no longer had homes to return to. Mail piled up in burnt-out post offices addressed to people who no longer existed. For weeks, the smell of the dead hung over the city. But then even that faded, and with it, the evidence that so many had ever lived. By April, Tokyo's streets had been cleared enough for carts and work crews to move through. The ashes were swept into ditches or shoveled into vacant lots. No one marked where. Even the officials stopped counting. Because every number only deepened the shame, the proof that the empire's capital had become a city of the unburied. And so, to survive, Tokyo learned to stop naming its dead. But someone still had to face them. Someone had to lift what the flames had left behind. They didn't fight a battle, they cleaned one up. When the air finally cleared, Tokyo sent out a new kind of army, not with rifles, but with ropes, shovels, and bamboo poles. They were called Taiyohan, the response teams. Though most were students, laborers, or anyone still strong enough to stand, their task was simple and unbearable: gather the dead. The heat had baked the ground so hard that shovels bent against it. Many of the fallen were fused to the earth or to each other. The air stank of fuel, decay, and something no one could describe. Each team worked for hours without speaking. Words didn't help. A 19-year-old student, Hiroshi Takeda, left behind a small notebook. In it he wrote, "I carried 50 bodies that day. By the end, they no longer felt heavy. That frightened me most. The workers tried to show respect where they could, arranging the bodies with hands folded, whispering a prayer before moving on. But soon exhaustion took over. The human mind has limits. Many fainted, some vomited. Others grew numb, their faces blank as they lifted child after child from the ashes. One volunteer remembered a single image that haunted her forever. A little girl holding a tin lunchbox. The box was burned shut. I couldn't open it. They wore masks soaked in vinegar to dull the smell, but it seeped through anyway. When the vinegar ran out, they used rags dipped in green tea. By night, they slept in temples or burned out schools. But most couldn't sleep at all, they said. They still heard the sirens in their dreams. And yet, even in the ruins, compassion survived. One elderly monk walked alongside the workers every day, chanting sutras with a broken voice. When asked why he did it, he said, "Because someone must tell them they are not forgotten." Each body they lifted carried a story of love, of family, of the ordinary lives that war turned into smoke. And though their hands grew blistered and raw, they refused to stop, because if they stopped, who else would remember? The fire had killed in one night. The silence killed slowly, one memory at a time. These workers of the dead fought that silence, the only way they knew, by giving form to what had been lost. And when the last cart rolled away, the city was lighter, emptier, and quieter still. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history isn't just about battles and generals, but about the people left behind, consider subscribing. It helps us bring more of these forgotten voices back into the light. But the silence didn't end with the workers. It moved into offices, into ledgers, into ink and stamps. Tokyo was about to discover that even grief could be filed away. Paper became the new grave. In the weeks after the air raid, Tokyo's remaining government buildings filled with the living who carried ghosts in their hands. They came with burnt photographs, scraps of letters, fragments of identity papers, anything that might prove that someone had once existed. Police stations overflowed. School gymnasiums were turned into makeshift registration halls. People stood in line for hours, waiting for a clerk who could not give them what they truly needed, a name back. The process was mechanical. Stamp, ink, file, next. Each person received a slip, deceased, missing, or unknown. The same stamp used for taxes and ration cards now sealed the end of entire families. One widow, Haruko Ishii, later recalled, "I gave them my husband's photo. They said it was not enough. I gave them his army postcard. They stamped missing, I asked. When they would change it to dead, they said, 'When you bring his ashes.' But there were no ashes. There was no grave to visit, no proof to deliver. Only memory, and memory didn't count on paper. For every person who came forward, 10 more never did. Some were too ashamed to admit survival when their neighbors had perished. Others had no one left to report. The clerks grew numb. They stopped looking up when names were spoken. The scale of the loss had outgrown compassion. Within months, Tokyo's official death register listed only about 80,000 victims. Privately, everyone knew the truth was much higher, perhaps double. But no one argued. There were more pressing orders now. Rebuild, clean, move on. And so, many of the dead disappeared twice, once in the fire and once again in the files. The silence had found a new form, the bureaucratic kind, made of carbon paper and stamps. At one burned-out ward office, an officer wrote in his log, "They come asking for the dead. I give them paper. I don't know if that helps or hurts." For the families, the paperwork was a ritual of mourning without mourning, a legal act standing in for grief. When they walked away from those desks, most didn't cry. They simply bowed and carried their papers home, like holding a coffin made of ink. The fires had taken the bodies. Now, bureaucracy took the memory. But beneath the documents and the silence, the city still held its secrets, because as reconstruction began, Tokyo's past wasn't erased, it was buried. Where neon lights shine today, the ground still holds its dead. In the rush to rebuild, Japan's leaders saw only the future, the dream of a modern Tokyo, steel and concrete, rising from ashes. But beneath every foundation, every subway tunnel, every polished street, the past refused to stay buried. By 1947, new housing districts had begun to sprout across what had once been fire zones. The ashes of the dead, mixed with soil and debris, were shoveled into trenches to make new ground stable. No one marked where, no one dared to stop. Construction foremen later admitted they knew what they were building over. One said quietly in an interview decades later, "We poured concrete on bones, we all knew, but we had to move forward." In neighborhoods like Shitamachi and Asakusa, families rebuilt homes directly over mass burial sites. Children played in gardens where, just 2 years before, the earth had glowed with embers. When elders swept their porches, they sometimes found small fragments of porcelain or bone, not from buildings, but from people. They said nothing, only bowed and swept the dust away. In the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, as Tokyo expanded again, workers digging subway lines near Ueno and Sumida began to uncover skeletons scorched, fractured, and tangled together. There were no dog tags, no clothes left, just bone and silence. A construction worker named Matsuo Kanda described what he saw while laying pipe under Kototoi Bridge. "We thought they were animal bones at first. Then we found a child's bracelet. Work stopped for a day, then continued." The remains were quietly collected and moved to temple grounds nearby, sometimes cremated again, sometimes reburied with no record. Some locals began to whisper prayers when walking those streets. They'd pause at certain corners, bow their heads slightly, and move on. No signs, no markers, only memory guiding them. To this day, some older residents will tell you, though only if you ask gently, that certain parks and intersections don't sleep easy, that, on humid summer nights, the air still smells faintly of smoke. But Tokyo itself has learned to live with its ghosts. The city hums, glows, and grows, never stopping, never slowing. And yet, beneath its rhythm lies a strange kind of stillness, one that hums just low enough for those who remember to hear. Because even as cranes rose and neon replaced flame, the ground below never forgot what it carried. Every skyscraper, every bridge, every subway station rests on a foundation made not only of stone and steel, but of lives once lived there. The city had risen again, cleaner, taller, louder, but silence has a way of following the survivors home. Even amid the roar of progress, Tokyo's quiet grief lingered not in the streets anymore, but in the hearts of those who rebuilt them. Japan rebuilt its walls faster than its memories. By the early 1950s, the fires were long gone, but the silence had only deepened. Tokyo was healing on the surface. Factories buzzed again. Children played baseball in empty lots that had once been ruins. Newspapers printed stories of recovery, of pride, of victory through perseverance. But not a word about the graves beneath the streets. Not a word about the missing. The survivors knew the truth. They just stopped saying it aloud. Grief had become private, a burden folded neatly into daily life. The government built monuments for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, symbols of peace, reminders of nuclear horror. But Tokyo's firebomb victims had no such memorial. Their tragedy had no political value. It was simply inconvenient. A survivor named Yumiko Arai later told an interviewer, "When the rain smells like smoke, I still see the sky on fire. But people don't like to talk about it. They think we should be proud, not sad." So Tokyo learned to mourn in whispers. No speeches, no ceremonies, just quiet gestures of remembrance. Every March 10th, some families still placed incense by drain pipes, left rice balls at crossroads, or lit small candles in alleys. They never called it an anniversary, only that night. There were no cameras, no reporters, just old hands clasped together in the dark. In narrow streets where wooden homes once stood, some residents built tiny neighborhood shrines. No one asked permission. They simply placed a stone, a photo, a name. Sometimes not even that, only the word heiwa, meaning peace. Children walking to school passed them daily without knowing why they were there, but the elders did. They remembered who was missing from every house on that block. Silence became a kind of language between generations, the things not said, the stories not told at dinner tables. When asked decades later why she never spoke about the fire to her children, an old woman smiled faintly and said, "They were born in peace. Why should I bring them the smell of smoke?" For many survivors, that silence was both protection and prison. To forget meant betraying the dead. To remember meant reliving the night. So they carried memory quietly, like a folded letter never sent. The world looked at Japan's post-war boom, its lights, its technology, its efficiency, and called it a miracle. But miracles always have ghosts. Beneath the progress and the neon, Tokyo's heart still pulsed with unspoken sorrow. And sometimes, when the city paused just before dawn, when the trains had not yet begun, and the wind moved through the alleys, it felt as though the smoke had never left. The fire was gone. But its memory still drifted through the air, invisible and waiting to be noticed. Many of these graves have no names, but every time we tell their story, we give them one. If you'd like to help keep these memories alive, share this video, because remembrance is the only thing stronger than silence, but even silence cannot hold forever. In time, the earth itself began to remember unearthed bones, uncovered stories, and voices rising softly through the dust. Every step you take in Tokyo is over someone's story. In the decades that followed, the city kept building upward taller towers, deeper tunnels, new subways snaking beneath old districts. But the ground remembered everything. In 1995, workers digging near Kototoi Bridge, the very area that once glowed like a furnace during the raid, unearthed bones. Hundreds of them. Some fused together, others curled in circles, as if still trying to protect one another. There were no coffins, no markers, only ash and bone mixed into the clay. The discovery barely made the newspapers. The headlines were about the economy, technology, the future. But for those who knew, it was a wound reopened. A volunteer historian named Takahiro Wada spent his weekends cataloguing artifacts from those digs: melted coins, burned rosaries, bits of glass still clouded with soot. "The ground tells the truth," he said. "We just stopped listening." His small team began tracing family registers, cross-referencing names of those still listed as missing. Some matches were made, most were not. But for each discovery, they held a quiet ceremony, no speeches, no applause, just a moment of silence. And slowly, across Tokyo, small memorial stones began to appear. Not official monuments, but the work of local hearts. A single granite slab behind a convenience store in Sumida, a small pillar under a cherry tree in Asakusa, a weathered plaque near Ueno Station that simply reads, "The 10th of March, 1945 peace." There's no mention of how many died or who they were, just that one word, peace. In spring, when the cherry blossoms bloom, the petals fall over those hidden graves like snow. Children laugh, tourists take photos, couples stroll hand in hand. None of them know what lies beneath the roots of those trees. But some nights, when the air is still and the moonlight hits the river, the city seems to exhale as if Tokyo itself remembers. For the few remaining survivors, that knowledge brings comfort, not fear. One elderly man, who lost his family in the raids, visits Kototoi Bridge every March 10th. He brings a single flower and says, "They never left. They just became the earth that holds us up." There are no fences around those graves, no names carved in stone. But maybe that's how the city prefers it, remembrance spread everywhere, not trapped in one place. Because Tokyo doesn't need a monument to remember. Tokyo is the monument. a living city built on courage, silence, and the unburied memory of those who came before. And yet, for every whisper of peace, there's an echo of what came before the sirens that once tore through the night. Their sound may be gone, but their memory hums in the still air between trains, in the hush of early morning streets. And in that silence, Tokyo finally learned to speak again. When the sirens ended, Tokyo didn't go quiet, it began to whisper. The city rebuilt itself, mile by mile, floor by floor, street by street. Skyscrapers rose where wooden homes had burned. Subways tunneled under streets where children once played. Neon lights replaced fires, commerce replaced chaos. But the memory of that night never left. It moved into the hearts of the survivors, into the quiet gestures of families, into the soil beneath every foundation. The dead were uncounted. The graves were unmarked. Yet every flower left in a corner, every candle lit in a narrow alley, every prayer whispered into the night became a voice for those who could no longer speak. One elderly woman lights incense at dawn near Sumida. She bows, whispers names she still remembers, and leaves quietly. No one watches, no one records it. And yet, it matters. For Tokyo, silence became its own memorial. A city that carries both its life and its loss in every street, every subway car, every breath of wind. The fires took homes, families, and futures. The silence that followed took memory too. But by remembering, Tokyo reclaimed both. Because even when the sirens ended, the city never truly went quiet. It learned to speak softly, to honor what was lost, and to carry forward a living tribute to the lives that burned and the graves that never were. If this story moved you, share it not for likes, but so that the silence of those lost in Tokyo is never complete. Subscribe to hear more forgotten voices and join us in remembering history the way it was lived with courage, grief, and quiet resilience.